guys, welcome to the video on trade liberalisation and inflation. So what we're going to look at in this video is the relationship between trade liberalisation and demand inflation as well as cost inflation. So as we know, demand pull inflation is inflation that is caused by excessive aggregate demand, and cost push inflation rather, is inflation caused by increases in the cost of production. We're going to see how trade liberalisation, being the breakdown of international barriers, and how that can help achieve inflation, or the government's target range of 2 to 3% CPI. Okay, so firstly, we know that trade liberalisation is the globalisation or the use of open markets. And what this means, I'm just going to note this trade liberalisation. So what this means is that there is very few barriers to trade. Few barriers to trade. And so the government has cut tariffs, reduced subsidies, abolished quotas, and made free trade agreements. So there is a movement of goods and services between countries, and that movement is facilitated more easily. So as we know, we're going to look at inflation in two halves. We're going to look at demand. We're going to look at demand pull inflation first. If you want to remind yourselves what demand pull inflation is, I encourage you again to look at the lecture specifically designed for demand pull inflation. You can look at, and that will be under the goal of low inflation in our series of lectures. Okay, so with trade liberalisation, demand pull inflation is caused by excessive aggregate demand. As we know, aggregate demand is given by this equation here. So with demand pull inflation, we can see that aggregate demand in the economy usually exceeds aggregate supply. And so when that happens, suppliers would actually increase their price in order to maintain or to maximize their profit margins. So now with cuts in tariffs, with reduced subsidies, abolished quotas, and more free trade agreements, this means we import more, and our imports would increase. So firstly, as we can see, because imports, you take away that from aggregate demand, mathematically we can see that when imports increase, aggregate demand should decrease, because imports and aggregate demand have an inverse relationship. So that's a mathematical view of it. But a theoretical view, or a logical view of it, is that because if we don't exist in a country with an open market, if we exist in a nation or an economy where there are tariffs, subsidies, quotas, and very few free trade agreements to help protect local industries, this means that we rely on local industries. To provide for goods and services. And when our aggregate demand increases, this means sometimes, because these local industries prove inefficient, that sometimes they can't provide for our aggregate demand here. And that's why aggregate demand exceeds aggregate supply in cases where we live in a closed economy. So when we open our economy to overseas nations, this means we can import more. And therefore imports can make up for the surplus in aggregate demand. And we can see this in this equation, a very simplified supply and demand equation. So we have supply here, demand here, price and quantity. If for whatever reason demand is here at this price and supply is here, we can see that there is an excess in demand over supply. So supply being here, the quantity supplied, and the quantity demanded. In this economy, when this happens, the supply or the price will increase so that we reach an equilibrium, and therefore demand will contract. And this makes the economy worse off because we're not maximizing our living standards by consuming more goods and services. However, in an open economy, this discrepancy between demand and supply is made up for by imports. So what this suggests is that the price will stay low at this world price here, at P1, rather than to increase to an equilibrium price in a closed economy. So that's how demand pull inflation can be eased through trade liberalization. Secondly, we're going to look at cost push inflation. So what this means is that inflation is caused by supply side factors. So when people or when businesses experience high production costs, then they would have to increase the cost of their goods and services in order to maintain profit margins. However, what trade liberalization does is that it promotes competition. And as we can see from this graph, there is now more competition because we can supply or can purchase goods and services from imports or imported goods and services. We don't necessarily rely on domestic production anymore. So when it promotes competition, it forces local producers to cut costs, and that is done through efficiency. So in the long term, we will move our resources into areas of comparative cost advantage or greatest efficiency. And furthermore, because we are able to import at a much cheaper price, and as we know that imports are not 80% of inputs. When our imports are cheaper due to these free trade agreements or due to this open market economy situation, we can see that the cost of production would be much lower than if it were without the facility of imports. So with tariffs on imports, that would make our imports more expensive, and since imports are 80% of inputs, therefore our cost of production would be more expensive. By cutting tariffs, we can see that imports would therefore become less expensive because there will be no tax payable on importing goods and services, usually intermediate goods or services, such as machinery or capital. And so what this means is that cost push inflation can be eased through better uses or cheaper imports in general. So that's how cost inflation can be eased, by reducing production costs and to promote greater efficiency in the production of goods and services. So overall, trade liberalization can help achieve the goal of lower inflation.